Hi, and welcome to another episode of I Mustache You Something. Today I've got Jonathan Adly, who's a new friend of mine you're from the Maryland area, Jonathan?
Yeah, from Delaware, nearby.
Nearby. Yeah,
Almost there.
I'm originally a New Yorker, so,
Yeah,
everything outside of the New York, it's like, oh, somewhere over there, somewhere down there.
yeah.
And I realized that the only people worse than New Yorkers is Bostonians because
Yeah,
for Bostonians, everything's down there. At least there aren't any two directions. It's just one direction, like that way. They'll refer to everything as west of Worcester, which is really narrow-minded. But God,
yeah.
God bless them anyway. So forgive me. Yeah, you're in
No, no,
Delaware.
no. I used to live in New York too, so I know that feeling.
Yeah, so you're part of the New York snobbery, the
Yeah,
New
yeah.
England, elitism. So you understand the mindset.
I understand.
So we're just getting to know each other. We met recently through Coptic Voice, and you were telling me how you came to the U.S. when you were 15, and you were originally from Venezuela. Uh, so in talking about um, your progress as you moved here and your studies, you're kind of intimating that, of course I did well and of course I studied. So what's the alternative? Like if you didn't do well and you didn't study and you weren't successful, what kind of banishment would you have faced?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it just it's just really hard when someone comes in here and they they got a whiff of Sinawayam in Egypt. I don't know what's a good translation for that, but like high school in Egypt, uh, it just everything becomes like this is what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to study, you're supposed to do well, you're supposed to get good grades. And I didn't really contemplate too much on like what would be the alternative. So I don't know if I can give you a good answer there.
So clarify that for some people, because I think those of us, so I was born in Egypt and I, went back regularly and my cousins were there. They live in Australia now and in the United States now. Most of the cousins, at least, some of them still live in Egypt. Actually, I think one of them is actually in Germany. But I think people that grew up here kind of have a sense of this, but they don't really know exactly what you're talking about. And I think it might be helpful to some of the listeners to know exactly what you mean about Senaway Amma and this need to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say even a need to achieve. It's more of a second nature. Um, but um, but basically, when there's an only one path forward, which is to do good in school, because for many reasons in Egypt, that, there's nothing really like you will do good in school and you may or may not succeed. And if you're doing good in school, then you're definitely not going to succeed, especially for us as Copts. So it becomes as a second nature that you grow up with, um, where um, where it's not like an option. I can do I can not do good in school and be successful, as many examples in the US. Actually, a lot of the people in the US that didn't do good in school are successful. It just becomes like the only way forward is to do good in school. And, thankfully, I always grew up in a healthy environment where there wasn't like a lot of pressure to do well, but there was like like almost unspoken expectation that this is the way we do things. It's a similar, if someone grows up going to church every Sunday, then there comes when they grow up, this is the expectation. On Sundays, I go to church. It's not an extra burden. It's not something they have to plan. It's just the way it is.
And the people that do well in Egypt, what do they end up doing?
They end up coming to the US.
Well, specifically, like in terms of like, because you mentioned the Sanawi Amma, and I find
Yeah,
this hysterical that like, if you do really, really well for Sanawi Amma, you get kaza,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
kaza. So what's the breakdown?
I don't know. It's a mess, really. I mean, obviously, if you do like 99%, you'll become a doctor. If you do like 95, you become a pharmacist. And God forbid, if you got 91, you become an engineer. But in reality, it's very tough there. Even if you become one of these things, you would likely try to immigrate at some point, and if you get the opportunity, you will immigrate. So
So I think the pigeonholing that we have here is a byproduct of the
yeah,
pigeonholing that
yeah,
happens there, right?
yeah,
So if 99 في ثانوية عامة made you a musician or an artist,
yeah,
guaranteed, like all the kids here would be getting pushed. Like, مش قلت لك تبقى مزيكاني? I told you, you
yeah,
have to be in music, only music. And
yeah,
it just happens to be that in Egypt, 99 is a doctor. So here, like,
yeah,
God forbid, like, you become something that's not a 91 or a 95 or a 99,
yeah.
because
And,
that's the
and
rating system that they brought with them, I think.
and it's really a historical accident. I mean, uh, it's well documented that Nasser in the 50, that was his sorts of like an ideal society of like one of doctors and pharmacists and engineers. And when they set up the system, it was meant to be like, we want as many people as possible to be doctors, pharmacists, and engineers. And it got printed in our brains, in our parents' brain, that this is what success looks like. Uh, and But it doesn't really. I mean, success is just doing what you love and being good at it. So
So would you consider Nasser then having been successful in his goal?
very successful. I mean, if you honestly, if you ask, if you walk into a random Copt in the US and Australia and Germany, whatever, and then we ask them, hey, would you consider yourself an Arab Christian? More than likely they would say yes. But if you ask the same question to someone who was 1951, he would tell you, of course not. I'm not. I'm an Egyptian.
So tell me more about that, and I'll clarify for some of the listeners here that you're actually an expert in church history, and you're an expert in sort of reflecting back on our past to clarify, how we got to where we are. And this is actually how we met. So, a lot of the people that are going to be on this mustache series are people that I've known for a long time, but you and I met recently,
Yeah.
and I was taken with the depth of your love, first of all, and also the depth of your knowledge in this area. And you actually have a very successful podcast that you've had for a while that focuses on church history. So we'll come back to this Nasser question, but first tell us about your podcast and your interest in church history and how we got there.
Yeah, so the podcast is called The History of the Copts, and I set it up from the very beginning to be the history of the Copts as a people. And unfortunately, by historical circumstances, uh, we were kind of like everything was taken away from us as a people, that the only thing that was left is the church. So when you tell a history, it's like the history of the church. But this is incredibly inaccurate because there was whole kind of things going on that the church has nothing to do with for the history of the Copts as a nation and as a people. And that story, of course, is not being told in the churches because it has nothing to do with the church. So our knowledge of who we are, our heritage, our culture, is pigeonholed into the church stuff, which is important. Like, I want my kids to be good Christians, and I want everybody to be a good Christian. But at the same time, I want them also to appreciate their heritage beyond what the church offers, because the church was just a small part of a civilization that lasted 2,000 years from the arrival of St. Mark until our modern time. As a matter of fact, we claim someone like Rami Malek to be, an Oscar-winning, Coptic person. But I don't even know if he even goes to church now. It doesn't really matter. He's still going to be a Coptic person anyway. So this is what the podcast is really about. It's a history of the people. And the church obviously is heavily featured in there because at times it was the only part and a big part, but it's not the only thing that's featured in there.
It's interesting that you bring that up because the Coptic identity is definitely something that is a difficult thing to put a finger on, right?
Yeah,
And I think different people will define it differently. Some
yeah,
people define it geographically, some people define it spiritually, some people define it historically, um, some people define it ethnically,
yeah.
and it's definitely an interesting question. And it sounds like you take sort of a historical lens and a historical approach.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, we talked about this in Coptic voice. It comes up, like, as you can imagine, in every conversation that, we engage in. And the answer that we're comfortable with, or at least I'm comfortable with, again, you'll find like variation of opinions somewhere. It's really self-identity, right? Self-identity, if you identify as a Copt, and if you have any kind of connections, either with the church or Egypt, then, then you're Coptic. But yeah, it's very hard to define anything narrower than that because just these things are very difficult.
and I think that's interesting that you point that out, that it's a self identity, right? It's not something
Yeah,
that someone else can impart on you.
yeah,
And one of my favorite people from our parish actually is Federico.
yeah,
He and his wife Nancy joined our parish a few years ago, and I mean he's like the most Coptic guy I know, and he's this
yeah.
white guy from Lynn, um, and he recently uh, I don't have his permission to mention this, but I'm going to mention it anyway, and I'll just get his permission. But he did like his sort of DNA test thing, and he discovered that he had like Egyptian blood, like he had like some Coptic in him. He's like, guys, I'm 12% Coptic. It was meant to be. And he's excited, and we're excited. We're like, yes, you're one of us. We knew you were one of us.
Yeah,
But he definitely self-identifies as a Copt, both in terms of his relationship with our community, his spiritual orientation, and I guess now 12%
the
by blood
12%.
as well.
Yeah.
Um, and I
I mean,
think
it shouldn't really matter. It's like, being an American, right? I mean, if you identify as an American, you're an American. It doesn't really matter what it is. And for us, I mean, we have this, I guess, perverted sense of like some kind of like, undisturbed heritage all the way back to the pyramids. But people don't know, like at some periods of Egypt, there was like a lot of Armenian migration. Like one of the things I'm doing right now is talking about a period where there was a lot of Armenians migrating into Egypt, and these people assimilated. And I'm sure a lot of us right now have that heritage. So, and there are Syrians as well, and there was all kind of like migration back and forth into and outside of Egypt. So
so. Let's bring that back then, because it's a nice segue back into our initial question about
yeah,
the Arab versus Egyptian identity. So can
yeah,
you clarify for us? Because I know what you mean, but I don't know if everybody does. So can you clarify what that distinction is?
yeah. I mean, the Arab thing is so wishy-washy, and throughout history, like people in Egypt never really said that we are Arabs. They were Egyptians, and even the Arabs that immigrated into Egypt, they understood that they are Arabs and then there's Egyptians. That's why they call them Copts. And in modern history, as the Ottomans were in control of Egypt under Muhammad Ali, people understood that there was a Turkish, ruling elite, and everybody else is Egyptian. Um, when the revolution happened in 1952, um, it was very Nasser had a big project of like involving a lot of geopolitical countries in his, I guess, project, so to speak, and for the Middle East. And the only thing that he could find that can somehow unite them together is the Arab. So Egypt became the Arab Republic of Egypt. And that's been since the 50s, and that have, to this day, have perverted both our sense of self and as well as, the average Egyptian who thinks of himself as an Arab. But if you ask his grandfather the same question, he would tell you, of course not, I'm an Egyptian.
So before that, before the 1950s, um, the people that were the ruling elite, Like I think the last guy was King Fuad, right? Is that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so? What was his identity, King Fuad?
I mean, of course, he has like the public persona of the father figure of Egypt, right? Uh, um, but obviously, especially the people before him, they they had to maintain their connection to the Ottoman Empire because those are the people who gave them legitimacy to rule. They were the governors of Egypt by the permission of the Sultan. So of course, as things moved on from Muhammad Ali to King Fuad, they felt that it was more convenient for them to be more Egyptian than Turkish. But I think if you got him to a room and be like, uh, why are you ruling Egypt? He would tell you because I'm Turkish and the Sultan granted me that right.
So his ethnic heritage was Turkish.
Yeah, Albanian. Muhammad Ali was Albanian, but that was under the Ottoman Empire. Turkish is again one of these wishy-washy things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're telling me, and this is new information to me. I'm learning this as we go, is that there was a distinction before Nasser that
Yeah.
there's sort of Muslim rule, right? But not
It was
falling
not
in,
Arab rule.
right.
Nope,
It
it was
wasn't
not.
Arab rule and it wasn't an identity that we sort of went along with, right? It was an
No.
outside power. Like maybe the British were in power or the French were in power,
Yes.
but they don't tell us who we are. And that shift happened in the 50s
Yeah.
that these rulers became quote unquote one of us. And if it's because of that internal definition that's happening, now we go along for the ride and we think that we are that label.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. So you as a modern Copt, how do you identify? How do you answer that question if someone asks you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always say that if someone asks me, I say I'm Coptic American, which is like, and I think my kids would identify the same way. I definitely, grew up in America. All my success is due to the system and the rule of law that is here. And then I obviously have a very strong connection to where I came from. And I think that the best thing to describe where I came from is being Coptic, being connected to the church and the heritage and the community and everything.
So if someone asks you if you're Arab, what's your answer?
So, I'm Coptic American. First, I asked them, what is an Arab, right? I mean, it's very hard to define what is an Arab. Is a guy in Somalia an Arab?
I have no idea.
Yeah, according to the University of Berkeley, they are Arab and white, but obviously they're not. So
So now that you bring that up, what do you put on your form? Like when you're
uh,
asking ethnicity?
so I don't know if you know the story of how officially we're white, and the story behind that.
Right.
There was a guy named, if I got the name wrong, forgive me, but I think his name was Marcus Samaika. And this guy came to the U.S. like somewhere in the 20s or 30s, and he wanted to marry a white person, but there was a black person cannot marry a white person, so the state prevented him. So he sued, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decided if you're an Egyptian, then you're white. So I think if you Google his name, he will come up. And he ended up winning like a gold medal and then dying in World War II. It's just a fascinating story that no one really knows about. But
So
I
he's
got
the reason I can't get financial aid.
that's basically, yeah, basically.
Like, come on, guy.
Yeah. But it's like I said, you have this history of the people that really no one knows about. And this guy his story is so fascinating. Like, he came here, his case went all the way to Supreme Court. Then he went to the Olympics and won a gold medal or a bronze medal or something. I forgot the details. and then he went to World War II, and then he died in the war, right? And this is a Coptic person, and basically maybe like 4 people have ever heard of. But his story is one of the things that impact us to this day, and that's why on a census form, you have to fill that you're white.
I put other because I refuse. I
So
refuse.
whatever. I mean, that's the official. The official answer is that you're white. If you don't want to identify it as that, then take it up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, كله من الواد ده.
Yeah, let me actually Google
all
his
because
name,
this one guy
'cause I
decided
wanna-
he wanted to marry this girl, and the country was so bigoted that he couldn't just marry her. So
Yeah.
now we're miscategorized.
I just want to Google his name because I don't want to give wrong information. So his name is not Marcus Samaika. It's Samaika, but I'll give you the details. But Marcus Samaika is probably related, but he's the guy who founded the Coptic Museum in Egypt. He's one of these elites, but the story exists. I just have to remember the name.
I think there's lots of people that are going to be now hopefully interested in this guy. And
Farid Samaika, that's his name.
what is it?
Farid Samaika.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's his name, not Marcus.
Yeah, they're all very good names.
Yeah, and his medal was in diving, not swimming. So he got a silver and a bronze medal.
So this guy decides that we're all going to be white. And now, in addition to being characterized as Arabs, we're characterized as white Arabs. So when someone asks us, who are we? We have to kind of question sort of these social norms and question these things that are being imposed on us.
Yeah.
And I guess my question to you is, at what point does it shift away from being something that we're allowed to say, right? Is it another 10 years? Is it another 50 years? Is it 100 years, right? Because the further away we get from that history that you're teaching us, the less relevant that history becomes in some people's opinion, right? Because if we're living in the present and if how we live our lives now, right? Oh, well, we haven't been called, Egyptians in 200 years, right? We've been Arabs, or the US government has recognized us as white for, 150 years. At what point does that history become irrelevant, in your opinion?
I mean, to me, it never becomes irrelevant. I cannot describe to you how much fulfilling who's doing the podcast is. As I go through the journey of, my grandfathers and your grandfathers and our grandmothers, and you see their struggles and the things that they went through and how everything repeats again, how churches were destroyed at a whim, how it was impossible for them to just simply go on church and pray to God the way that they liked it, and how there was always this internal struggle in the community between the old way of doing things and a new, better way of doing things. And you see the same patterns repeating over and over again. And you'll see it's never irrelevant. I mean, to this day, if you go to a Coptic church anywhere in the whole country, in the whole world, you will see, for the most part, the same exact things. And if you go in the history, you'll see these things will start to make sense. The way that we have our icons. Why do we have our icons this way? The way that I was just doing this morning, I was one of the projects I'm working on is to do like the minor canons of the Coptic Church, like canons that we wrote down that we're supposed to follow, but no one really knows about. And you see things in there, like why do we have 2 candles on the altar? Why do men and women sit separately? Why do you have to take your shoes when you walk into the church? And we do all these things in our life. And I guess some of us have stopped and questioned why, and they got some answer, and maybe they were satisfied, maybe they're not, and lived with it. But if once you know the history behind these things becomes much more meaningful. Um, and conversation starts to shift in your head, and you start to appreciate um, the meaning behind all these traditions. And even if it doesn't make 100% logical sense to you, you will say, you know, we had this thing going for 1500 years. Who am I to come now and be like, no, 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 that doesn't make sense. You can walk with your shoes into the altar. Like it's such a small things, like who really care? But if you understand the meaning behind it, and like, you know, this was an issue that had to be written down in a canon, and we never really wrote canons in the Coptic Church. Then you're like, you know, who am I to come and you know, change that 1500 years tradition just because it doesn't make sense to me?
So where are these things written down? Because I mean, you're right. I've asked these same questions and never been referred
Yeah.
to a text.
Yeah, so I'm writing a book. I mean, it sounds like a big deal, but it's not really a big deal.
It is a
I'm
big deal.
writing. No, it's not. It's really not. In our modern times, it's like, you know, uh, I think everybody, if they really know something and they need to let the world know, they can write a book. Like, you don't need, there used to be all the gatekeepers and complicated things in the past, but it's not. And if you come to us in Coptic Voice, you just give us like a manuscript and we'll take it from there. It's not that difficult. It's about these canons, and there's 4 canons that were written as the church was transitioning from a Greek/Coptic church to an Arabic church. There are the canons of Christodoulos, canons of Cyril, and the canons of Gabriel, as well as a big canon that ended up being the civil law for Ethiopia for a long time, actually. Uh, so that book will be the minor canons because they're not a big, and no one knows about them. So there's like a huge opportunity to add to the conversation there.
So we'll look forward to your book, but I guess this is the point in our conversation where I must ask you something.
Ask me away.
I was hoping to ask you what makes you so dedicated to amplifying the voices of other people, because you just mentioned now something like, so like, oh, off the cuff, oh, you know what, I am like, oh, what's the big deal, oh yeah, just send us your book and we'll publish it for you. I think that's kind of a unique gift that you and Marianne and Angeline and the other folks that I've interacted with at Coptic Voice, that there's this openness and there's this desire to take the voice of others and bringing it out to our community. So where does that come from?
So I'm not going to speak for them because they're much more altruistic than I am. But to me, I'm going to tell you a story. So I was trying, so as you know now, in our second generation, most of them don't speak Arabic, right? So I was trying to track down the life of Shenouda the Archimandrite in English. He's, for those who don't know, he's a saint in the Coptic Church, and he's quite significant, and he's very important from a historical sense too. But I was trying to track down his life in English for someone, because the Cynics our Cynicsarium, the Book of Saints, has only like 3 lines on him, but his life is like, he did a lot of things. He deserves a lot more than 3 lines. And there is only one book that was translated of his life in English. And if you go to Amazon right now, you'll find it. And if you read the introduction of this book, it is incredibly disrespectful to the Coptic heritage. It is very naive about the times where Shenouda the Archimandrite lived. And basically, if you, for whatever reason, you want to know about the life of Shenouda, and you only get this book, your idea of Shenouda would be very misguided. And it's not just that, actually. If you do the same with St. Athanasius, you'll find a book called Athanasius on Constantius, the politics of the empire. And one of the lines there is the guy, he's a Harvard professor, calling St. Athanasius a gangster, right? So if you're in college and you're studying any kind of humanities, this is one of the books that you probably come across. Same way in the Cambridge History of Egypt. Uh, there is a whole chapter where the population of Egypt was probably 80%. And the word Copt or Coptic there is written just once in the whole chapter. So if you come to that, we don't even exist. And when we do exist, it's not our story. It's someone else's story, and we just happen to be in there. And such a shame because we have completely neglected the side of our heritage, and we let our story be told by everybody else but us. And we have a lot of heritage. There's at least, when I did the podcast, there was at least 8 books about Shenouda the Archimedes. There was like Shenouda and the Women of the White Monastery, Shenouda and the Social Structure of Egypt. And then Athanasius is the same way. Athanasius is even worse. It's like 20 books. And we completely abandoned that. We're like, you guys can say whatever. We're going to have our own little church, and we're going to say our story from the Synaxarium. We don't care what you say. We're going to have our kids. We're going to grow up in the church, and that's that. And that worked for 2,000 years, right? Because everybody was separated, and there was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as the TV. But right now, anybody can Google the word. And I've seen this in my Sunday school. You give a lesson, and the kid pulls up his phone and Googles the name. And what happens if what you say is not the same that's in Wikipedia? Who's the kid that's going to believe? Is he going to believe you, the Sunday school teacher, who might not know what he's talking about? Or is he going to believe Wikipedia, which is at least some source of legitimacy? Like, I don't know. It's a very hard choice.
I mean, it's got to be true if it's on Wikipedia. I mean, anybody.
Listen, honestly, it's so funny. I encourage everybody to go and do the Arab conquest of Egypt, the Wikipedia article, or try to type Dioscorus in there. Dioscorus that's in our, see the stuff in there. We completely abandoned that, right? And to me, I'm doing it out of anger and frustration. Like, I want people to get involved. I want people to say that story, to give that heritage to the world, to say that when someone gets a piece of art from Roman Egypt that exactly looks the same as our icons in the church, he doesn't say, oh, we have this piece of cloth from Roman Egypt. He says, we have this piece of cloth from Coptic Egypt, which still, to this day, just walk into any Coptic church and you'll see exactly the same exact thing. So that's why I'm doing it. It's not in any way altruistic. It's, this is messed up and someone has to do something about it. And I wish it wasn't me, a pharmacist. I wish it would be someone who's like, more dedicated full-time to something like that. But I'm doing what I can, and I'm lifting up whoever wants to do it.
I mean, that's true of all of us that, grew up with that, you have 3 choices, right? You pick one of the 3 choices and then you do everything else that you want to do on top of it. Right?
Yeah. And to be fair, right now we do have a very good group of up and coming historians and humanities major. It's difficult because there's no money in these things, and those people want to do something because it's their field. They want to do something that's gonna pay them a salary basically, but no one really. This is not something that has money in it, so they end up doing something else.
But one way or another, whether it's people that are specialists in this or people that are sort of weekend and weeknight amateurs like you and I, you're hoping that we can shift that needle and be able to tell our own story.
Yeah, basically, the story is going to get told anyway. You're also gonna tell it as the person who lived it, because Athanasius is I'm claiming him. He's one of us, right? He's the Coptic patriarch. And he lived in Upper Egypt and he spoke Coptic. So if I'm not going to tell his story, someone else is going to tell it. And then it's my fault for abandoning him.
I mean, somebody had the audacity to tell me Athanasius was Greek. And I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Again, it's just because of us who never really engaged in these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And to me, you can call Athanasius Greek. I don't really, this is not going to offend me. What's going to offend me if you call him a gangster, right? And that's going to offend me. And that means like I failed doing what I'm doing as one of his children. So
To what extent do we have a responsibility also? Because you mentioned Dioscorus, and we mention him in our commemoration of the saints, and he's widely regarded by the rest of the Christian world as being a heretic and a monophysite, and the reason that the the See of Alexandria had to be sort of reclaimed to orthodoxy to align itself with the Chalcedonian position, right? So all of this happened in the 5th century, but if you listen to our morning doxology, and we're just getting to know each other, but the people that are listening to this that know me well won't be surprised at all that I'm doing this, because they know I'm a troublemaker. But we'll be praying the morning doxology, and if I have a high school or a college deacon standing next to me, we'll get to the verse about Dioscorus, and we'll say, "Our father, the confessor Abba Dioscorus, defended the faith against the heretics," right? And I'll turn to the deacon and I'll be like, what heretics do you think he's talking about? And they'll be like, "I don't know." And I'll be like, "The rest of Christianity." And they'll be like, "What?" So, I think there's definitely need for us to tell our story, but there's also definitely a need for dialogue, right? And for us to maybe soften our rhetoric and soften our language as well.
And you know what? I mean, the dialogue thing is fine and everything. And I guess defending our position, that's fine and all. But at least we need to tell the stories to ourselves, which sometimes doesn't happen. And if it happened, it will be very strictly narrowed, and Dioscorus is a patriarch. But Dioscorus was not just a patriarch. Dioscorus was a very powerful politician. Dioscorus was very close to the Emperor Theodosius the Younger. And had not Theodosius the Younger died in a freak accident, the whole conversation would have been different. So in the same way that, and if you only relied on the church, why would the church tell you about the relationship between Dioscorus and Theodosius the Younger? It's completely irrelevant to the faith. I mean, it's kind of relevant given everything that happened. But
became relevant.
Yeah, it became relevant. But I mean, that's not just who he is. He's a complete person, right? It's like telling the story like 100 years from now, telling the story of Pope Shenouda and completely ignoring all his political back and forth stuff that he got involved in. But that's what made him so great, right? He was not just a theologian writing books. He was that, and he was a great theologian. But he also navigated a very difficult time in Egypt, and he did it wonderfully, leading his people, and that's why he's remembered now as one of the saints. Same for Pope Carolus, right? If we let things be, we're only going to remember the miracles. But Pope Carolus was not just about the miracles, as you may or may not know. Before him, the church was in a very difficult position, and he really put the patriarchy in like a solid footing. But all these stories are never told. So,
I mean, you're referencing Pope Carolus, and his story, fortunately is being told. And, Father Daniel Fanous from
the book that got published. Yeah.
Absolutely phenomenal book. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it.
No, I had a chance to read it. It's a very, I wish it would be more widely accessible by everybody, basically.
I mean, I think it was chapter 8 that was highlighting the relationships between between Pope Carolus and his spiritual children. Pope Shenouda, Emperor Gregorius, Abuna Metin Miskin, and all of these people that he basically empowered to bring the church out of the darkness and into the light. And I think if people read nothing else, skipping ahead to that chapter is completely eye-opening.
Yeah, but we need 100 books like that. and I love what I think it's the Fordham University, but I may be mistaken. They have that group, and they published Pope Carolus' book, and before that they published Habib Girgis. And I love what they're doing, but why are they doing it and not us?
I mean, to a certain extent, and this is true of the the theological elite in our community, who, I won't mention any specific names because I wouldn't want someone to feel left out. But if you look at all of the people that are sort of the heavy hitters in theology in our community, they're getting their degrees at institutions of higher study that are non-Coptic.
Yeah.
And
Why?
so that, I mean, that's a good
That's a
question.
failing, right? That
Well,
means,
so so I'm supposed to be interviewing you, and I'm, here talking too much, and I apologize for that. But this goes to your credit as a podcaster, and my failing as a podcaster
no, no, no.
or whatever it is. But I think, I'll try to leave my personal opinion out of it. But I'm probing at that question for you to kind of reflect back to me a little bit based on what you think, because that is the reality, right? Like if you look around and you see, okay, this person, this person, this person, this person, they're getting their degrees at institutions of higher study that are non-Coptic, and that's just just an observation. The why or the how or how do we move forward from there is a different question.
Yeah, I mean, to me, is like we had the School of Alexandria, right? People came to study what we had to say. So what happened? I mean, I understand like a lot of things happened in Egypt like 1500 years ago, but to me, it's like maybe my expectations is higher, and I don't have a problem with people like studying like somewhere else. I actually think it's very helpful to see different perspective and different views. But I'm slightly annoyed that when we want to tell our story, we have to go to someone else to let us publish it. And that's what I think is like, okay, fine, you can study anywhere. And to be honest with you, if I was in their position, I would go there too, because that's the best education that's out there, right? Uh, but why are we not publishing these books? I mean, we had a bishop in our church when he want to publish one of these studies, he had to go through their press, their publishing arm, uh, and I mean, probably could have built your own uh, uh, press at this point, and that's what we're trying to do in Coptic Voice on a smaller scale. Um, but that's, I mean, I don't want to harp too much on that. But to me, I see like we need to tell our stories first ourselves. And when we do that really well, then we need to tell it to the world as well.
I I, uh, I was hoping that in listening to you, I would clarify for myself kind of why I'm doing this, because it started kind of just as a funny idea, and then it was like, no, but like there's definitely people who I find super interesting and super thoughtful that I've benefited from, you and the other people on the list, and I'm hoping to get their voices and their influence to go past me and the other people they have direct contact with to get to a broader audience. And I think that I think you're helping me as we do it kind of in real time to clarify, like, yeah, you're right. Like, these people have something to say, and these people are important thought leaders in our community, and in improving their reach and their capacity to shape the thoughts of the members of our community, I think is an important thing. And for us to do that ourselves, I think is something that I'll have to think about, because I don't know if I agree, and I don't think that it's an easy question of, should we do it ourselves, or should we partner with our Christian brothers and partner with like-minded members of our society to do it together. And I think that's something that
I mean, it's not one versus the other. I mean, that's just the way. Like, it's not a binary choice. But we cannot abandon the responsibilities and say, "Hey, you tell our stories." Sorry, you go ahead and tell our stories. We cannot do that. But if once you say, "I'm going to tell my story, come with me and help me," then yeah, sure. Then that's great, and that's how it should be. Uh,
That
but
makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, on that, I think we can thank you for sharing with us the importance of telling your story and being a agent in the telling of your own story. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
so this has been great. Like I told you, I hope it continues. And really good stories are made of multiple voices. So the more voices, the merrier.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate your wisdom, your thoughtfulness, and your time.
Thank you.
Take care.